Everyone, it is almost 9 o'clock and we will start our first session today. I'm very happy to have three really good presenters on the schedule, and thanks to all of you for joining us. We have three presentations. We will have each presentation about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we have time for discussions. For the discussion, we use the same procedure as yesterday. Please just write your questions in the chat, and after the presentation, we will select some of the questions, call you up, and you're welcome and invited to ask your question directly to the presenter. As I told you, we have three presenters today. The first one is Sonja Gabriel, and she's presenting to us her work on how do pre-service teachers see their education in times of distance learning, a qualitative study of university students during COVID-19. Not to take any time from our presenters, because they have much more interesting things to say than I do, I would invite Sonja and give you the floor.
So I hope you can see my presentation. I'm going to talk about a qualitative study I started about last year in April, after all these kind of COVID situations set in. And first of all, I would like to tell you just some key points about our university, which is situated in Austria, so Vienna and another place near Vienna. So we are a private university college for teacher education. We have about 2,500 students in pre-service teacher education. So they are all trained to become primary school teachers. We've got bachelor's and master's program. And additional to that, we also have in-service teacher training for all teachers, so not only primary school, but also secondary school in all subjects. In my study, I only looked at the pre-service teacher education, so all the students that really do their first studies at our university at bachelor's and master degrees. The situation at our university before Corona was that we relied nearly 100% on classroom teaching. So face-to-face teaching was the role of students coming nearly every day to university, having a strict timetable, which was given to them at the beginning of the term. So a bit more like school, I would say, than university. They also had to do practice in primary school each term. They're different depending on which term they are in. Sometimes they have one day in the week where they are at schools, and in later terms they have 2 weeks where they just do the teaching. Of course, we also had a learning management system model in our university before Corona. This was used by our lecturers voluntarily, so there was no obligation to use that. It was quite often used as just putting in some information for the students, or maybe for students to hand in tasks or whatever. And we did not have any online conferencing system or any kind of real e-learning kind of structured way of teaching over the distance. So of course, when the first lockdown in Austria struck universities, which was on 12th March of 2020, it was quite a shock for the university, for students and teachers alike, because we had to switch basically overnight to distance learning. So we learned on the 11th of March, so from tomorrow on, no more face-to-face teaching. And this distance learning also continued in winter term 2020 and also now in this summer term. We started in the winter term with face-to-face teaching. We tried to do it, but after 2 weeks we had to switch to distance learning again. And working with pupils, so really going to school, trying to teach there, and visiting schools was only partly possible because of all the restrictions and because of schools, of course, also going into distance learning. Of course, our university had to think of how to teach our students. So we had an online conferencing tool called Big Blue Button from end of April available for all our teachers. And especially in the summer term last year, most seminars were done in asynchronous mode, which we'll see in the results was quite a problem for the students because they just got a lot of tasks to do and to work on themselves without getting any real support or any kind of online meeting. Yeah, when talking about this Corona time, it's not e-learning, although a lot of people in Austria always talk about university switch to e-learning, but of course it's emergency remote teaching because e-learning is something that is planned carefully, which has a structure behind, and switching from one day to the other, from face-to-face teaching to distance teaching using digital media is not something like e-learning. So that's something we always have to bear in mind when we talk about the results and what went good and what did not go good. But of course, when it comes to distance learning or to e-learning, we know quite a lot of things because a lot of universities have used e-learning before and other institutions as well. So we know what's important when doing distance learning. It's important to have some kind of connection among the students and also the students being connected to their teachers. The social aspect is often missed by basically all the people involved in e-learning. And of course, if you do distance teaching using electronic media, you have to use a different way of teaching. You can't transfer one-to-one what you do in classroom teaching to online teaching. In order so that students see distance learning, e-learning as successful, they need to have a feeling that the online learning or the things they do via distance learning, they're useful to them. As the results of my study showed, not all of the tasks were seen as useful, which of course influenced their feeling or their attitude towards studying. They also need a sense of community and also something that was quite striking. We basically live in the 21st century, so we talk a lot about digital skills and media literacy, but it's not that all students and of course all lecturers have the necessary digital skills and competence. So the basic research question of my project was, how did students experience this sudden switch from classroom learning to distance learning? Were there problems? What went good? Do they maybe see advantages? What about their knowledge gain and so on? So quite a lot of sub-questions, but the main question, I wanted to find out how they experienced this. My methodology was using semi-structured interviews, of course, because of Corona, I had to use Big Blue Button online conferencing system to interview the students. I did 3 phases of interviews. So the first interviews took place last year, April and May 2020. I did a second round of interviews in October, November 2020, and a third round in January and February 2021 to see if there were any differences in the experience. Yeah, I've already talked a bit about the questions covered. So I wanted to know how they experienced the learning, so the tasks they were given, the seminars, basically. What about the practical work? What about the challenges? What they missed most, and how they think, did they learn anything, or was it kind of lost term, especially the summer term. My sample, I had in the first round of interviews 34 students, in the second round 35, and in the last round 32 students. For round 2 and 3, I wanted to have the same students. So the 32 students of round 3 were also interviewed in round 2. The first round were completely different students. About 10% of the students were male, which represents basically our students anyway, because we do not have much men studying at our university. So a primary school teacher in Austria is a typical kind of still female profession. So we only have about 10% of male students anyway. The students I interviewed came from bachelor degrees and master degrees. So the bachelor degree takes 8 semesters, 8 terms, and the master degrees 2 to 3 terms. And the age of the students interviewed was a wide range. The youngest one was 21, the oldest one was 52, most of them between 23 and 27, 28. But we always have also students that do our studies as kind of their second kind of job profession. Yeah, so some of the results. When talking about the tasks that were given, especially in the summer term last year, students told me that mostly they just had to read texts and summarize them or reflect on them. And it was, for some, it was okay, but especially after some weeks, they got bored with that, of course. So it was just reading, a lot of reading. They also said it took them much more time than it would have taken in face-to-face teaching. But they also said in some other seminars, their teachers thought about good tasks which had a lot of variations, and that it was demanding. So all of them said they have to be much more active than in a normal semester, a normal term, because in normal seminars, you can just maybe come and sit and listen. And here they always had to be active. The tasks changed a bit between summer term 2020 and winter term 2020, because also our university teachers got used to it and thought about a bit more variation in the tasks. So in summer term, this really was a big problem. Another big issue for our students was, of course, working with the pupils, because that's something which is, I would say, a core concept of our studies, to get them into practice quite early. And there were a lot of different experience made. Some said they just had to write lesson plans and send them to their teacher, and got a bit of feedback, but it was kind of something not very practical. Some of them did not see any pupils during the summer terms, some even not in the winter term. And that was, of course, a big problem, because they think they need to work with the pupils in order to get more practice. Some others told me they were able to teach online, of course, because they were not allowed in summer term and winter term to go to schools. This teaching online was also seen in a from very different perspectives. So some of them said it was a really good experience. Some said, it was different. It did not give them much knowledge gain. But it's of course completely different if you teach online than face-to-face. And also sometimes the pupils were at home, sometimes the pupils were at school and there was their class teacher there. So it was a lot of interesting things, and I could see there was not one line going so that all the students had kind of a similar experience. It was very, very varied. So it always depended which school they were doing the practice. Regarding the challenges, it was kind of, yeah, so that most of them told me it's not meeting. So they did not get any oral instructions. Everything was put in writing. It was not so easy to ask if there was a misunderstanding. And of course, a big challenge was when they had to read text and summarize things. It took them much more time. So they had much more, some of them really told me it stresses them out because they are in front of the computer all day long and just reading and writing. And so this was one big challenge, especially at the beginning. It got a bit better in winter term when there was more synchronous teaching, but the summer term really was hard for most of the students. Another challenge were group works, because students at first did not know how to do group work, especially also in summer term, because they had no idea how to organize when they were not able to meet face to face. So although most of our students are the so-called digital natives, they really had troubles organizing themselves. That was quite interesting for me because most of them did not know how to use shared files, how to organize an online meeting themselves. So sometimes, yeah, they were telephoning or just writing WhatsApp messages, and it was really hard for them to work together on a presentation or a text. Yeah, what did they miss? Of course, the social contact of being together as a group, and especially that's something that's still true for this summer term, these in-between discussions and conversations, because even if you have now synchronous teaching, it starts when the university teacher starts the seminar and then it ends, and there is no possibility for them to have kind of a talk or to sit somewhere together. So that's something, so this university life, the typical they were used to, they still miss a lot. Yeah, and what about the knowledge gain? It was also very interesting. Some of the students said they did not learn more or less, so it was basically the same. They got the facts, just the practice with the pupils. They agreed on that it was completely different and they did not learn that much. Some of them said they even learned more because they had to do more things on their own and did not get everything presented, and had, of course, more computer skills and other skills they would not have gained when they had a normal semester. And some said, yeah, they learned less. So there was no agreeing on that. So it was really a very personal feeling of them. Yeah, so what are the conclusions? What did our students, or what do our students still see as positive? So they like the flexibility now, because most of our students have to travel to university for an hour or even more. So now they don't have any travel. But they also said it's important to have a clear structure, to know what has to be done until which time. To create some kind of social presence. So they need this synchronous meeting. So everything just getting a task and working on it, that's terrible for them. Of course, what we have to work on at our university teachers need some more skills, more pedagogical skills, more didactics when it comes to teaching online. And of course, the practical work with the pupils is best done face-to-face. So all these kind of online things were just, yeah, a way out, but not the ideal thing. So that was just some results of my study. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer all your questions now.
Thank you so much. It was a really interesting insight into your students' experience. And of course, we have already the first question. Livia, do you want to pose your question?
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I'm quite familiar with the Austrian context, but I was wondering whether you assume that this new form of teaching stimulated different facets in the professionalization process of the teachers. So, for example, you gave the example that at the beginning they get a schedule and that they get a really strict information what is to do. And maybe based on that experience you had this semester, maybe you changed some structures or some things in your initial teacher education program.
Yeah, so there are already discussions going on. We know distance teaching is basically has come to stay with us, so we will not have, or we will not go back to 100% face-to-face teaching. About the organizational thing, I think my university has to learn quite a lot about that, because that was the problem in October when we started with face-to-face and a bit of online teaching. And it was kind of, yeah, when should we do the online teaching? Because you had to agree with the students as a lecturer yourself. So it was really very demanding for the students, for the lecturers to do that. So the structures, you're right, have to change as well. At the moment, we're just thinking, okay, which kind of, maybe all the lectures will be more online and not just face-to-face. And some seminars have to stay 100% face-to-face, because like sports or things like that, it's really hard to do that online, and some will be kind of a mixture. So there's a lot of changes going on because of this experience in Corona. And yeah, I'm quite curious what will happen.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think you can also just raise your hand instead of writing it in the chat. Yes, Livia, please go on.
Well, I could ask another question as well. So you were talking about the initial teacher training, but your university or your college is also responsible for the in-service training. Mm-hmm. So had you similar experience with the adaptation you did in the in-service training? Because you were also talking about the passive receivers, that the students were more or less passive receivers in the former times, and maybe due to the change that happened, the more active status of the participants was addressed more. So did you experience something in the in-service training programs as well?
Yes, of course, our in-service programs were also going online, of course, but they used more Zoom and all kind of online conferencing tools from the beginning on, because it would not have been possible to present an in-service teacher with some texts and just read that and you will find out yourself. So that would not have been possible. So at the beginning, a lot of seminars were cancelled. And then I think, after the Easter break, so in the end of April, most of them were taken as online meetings and trying to do that. I don't have too much insight in how satisfied the teachers were, but of course they needed, especially the in-service teachers, needed how to do things now online. So we had a lot more things to do to teach in-service teachers how to teach their pupils when they are not in classroom. But I think that this went completely different to our pre-service teacher training, unfortunately. So it's always a big difference between these two groups.
Any other questions? If not, I have one, even as a chair, I'm just taking the freedom as we have some minutes left. I was very curious about you talking about asynchronous teaching. You said it was very difficult for the students. I had some students who really told me, oh, we love this asynchronous teaching because now we can do the seminars and there is no overlapping anymore, and it gives us so much flexibility. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the reasons were, where the problems were?
I think the problem, if it had been kind of really good asynchronous teaching, it would be the same like your experience. But I think the problem was that our university teachers were kind of really did not know how to do good asynchronous teaching because they were used to go to classrooms and to discuss a lot. And now lots of them were really just read through this text and summarize the text and state your opinion on the text. And maybe not even a lot of them did forum discussions because many of them were not used to how to do things in Moodle. So that was a big problem, that our university teachers did not have any digital competence. So they learned a lot since Corona started, so things are getting better. But that, I think, was the biggest problem. So when having talked with the students in January and February, they already told that it was getting better, and they would love more to have asynchronous teaching than synchronous teaching, because then our rectorate decided in October, so all the seminars have to take place in a synchronous meeting, which was kind of completely contrary to having the summer term. And they had to switch from one seminar online to the other, and they were saying, okay, we have to sit in front of the computer and listen to and take part in seminars all day long, and that was completely tiring. So I hope now in the summer term we found kind of a good mixture between synchronous and asynchronous. But yeah, this experience told me our university does not know anything how to do good distance teaching. Yeah, so, but we have learned a lot, all of us.
I also want to thank you for a really interesting presentation. And I was wondering if you could, I mean, you talk a lot about these different ways of approaching online learning challenges. Could you talk a bit more about the new pedagogical ways you kind of addressed? Is there anything you'd want to?
Yeah, so we try to provide our university teachers kind of to give them the basics of what it means to teach in distance teaching. So last summer term, we were writing quite a lot of, or giving them a lot of tips, which tools they could use, or what they have to pay attention to when setting tasks. So this is still something we are at the moment developing. So we have to do quite a lot of training. I think we started to do in October training how to give good or how to teach in with all these distance learning tools, how to use our big blue button system, because most of our university teachers really had to learn the basics of where do I find what, how can I use a chat in, how can I use a forum. So it was really dealing with the basics. We tried to, and now we're trying to get them more in the advanced thing really of making plans and trying to really have a structure behind that. So it's still a long way to go. I think we're really still at the beginning. Not all of our university teachers, some of course are quite good at that, but I would say the majority of our teachers really has to do quite a lot of, but things change slowly as usual when it comes to education.
If there are no other questions, I want to say again, thank you to Sonja. It was a really interesting insight into what's going on in different parts, especially in Austria. So, and how universities handle it on an individual level. And thanks for keeping the time as well. This will give us enough time for the other two presentations. The next one is from a whole group of presenters, but today we have Claudia Schreiner and Livia Jesacher-Roessler here, who will tell us a little bit more about students' perception of learning and educational transitions during the pandemic. So it goes in a similar direction. Let's see if we have some additional and interesting insights. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and a warm welcome from us as well. We stay in Austria, so you're now a bit more familiar with our context, but we will give you some more insights as we are now changing from the higher education sector to the secondary education sector. So we are talking about the situations in school. And as already mentioned, we would like to have a closer look to the perception of learning and educational transitions during the pandemic, a topic where we think are not so discussed yet in relation to the pandemic. So first of all, I would like to give you a short overview of the project that our study is based on or based in. So we are doing research in an educational region, which is called Modellregion Bildung Zillertal, maybe a valley that you are familiar with because it's very popular for doing your winter and summer holidays there. So we work since 2014 together with the schools in that region to research different aspects of regional school development within this area. It's a rural area, which is obviously a valley in the Alps and has some characteristics that come along with the geographical situated position of this valley. We do have in total 39 schools in this valley, which is a lot for that small valley. So we do have 25 primary schools, 7 lower secondary schools, 3 special education schools, 3 vocational schools, and only 1 higher secondary school. I think that is interesting and very important to mention, because as we also talk about educational transition, we do have the traditional transition phase between primary and secondary at the grade 4th and 5th. And then we do have an educational transition at the grade 8th and 9th. And in Austria, we do have a very differentiated secondary or upper secondary school system where students have many choices to visit or to transit to different schools. Within the valley, they only have the opportunity to transit to the 3 vocational schools or the 1 higher secondary school. And if they do want to go another track, they have to leave the valley. I think that is important to know to recontextualize our data that we will present later on. What I think is also quite interesting, or maybe good to know, is that we have quite similar social economic environments for all the schools. So in the valley, we do have a very low academic status of the parents, with not many academic jobs that are offered within the region. And that is seen in the status or in the academic status of the parents as well. As I already mentioned, it's a very touristic area. So we have 32,000 people live in this area, but we have 6.5 million sleepovers a year. So that is something that influences this area a lot. I think these are some key informations that you can maybe get a bit of a better picture of how this region is structured. And I think later in the discussion, we will connect these information to our results as well. Another information is that you also already got some insights how the COVID-19 situation, the lockdown and the distance learning in Austria actually took place. We would like to give you some more detailed information about how this whole scenario was figured out by the schools. So the schools closed, quite similar to the university. So you said Friday the 13th. So we say here Monday the 16th of March until mid-May 2020. And we had then afterwards an alternating way of teaching. That means that only the half of the class was allowed to visit school for a couple of days. So they changed in the middle of the week, and the other group attended school. And in this kind of approach or this kind of system, the school year ended in July. We will give you later on a more detailed overview of how this actually continued in the school year 2020-2021, so this school year, because in Tyrol we had especially more difficult situations when it comes to distance learning, because the distance learning setting continued in this school year as well. What we also had, especially in Tyrol, was a very strict lockdown with curfew, which means that you were only allowed to get outside and move with or in your village, but you were not allowed to go outside of your village. So the radius of the movement of the young people was very, very limited. Austrian schools and generally were poorly equipped with digital devices. I think that is also an important background that is to mention, because compared to other OECD countries, the schools, the teachers, as well as the students had also a very low media competence, and that influences a lot of how the distance learning situation was handled and structured. So what we know from qualitative data is that there were differences in the implementation of distance learning, especially within the Model region. So at the beginning, there were no platforms and no digital-based solutions available. And each school started to develop their own approaches, how to contact the students, how to design the distance learning. And with the start of the Easter holidays, they decided to have a more uniform approach, or they tried to or started to exchange their approaches. And so they started, I would say, 3 or 4 weeks after the lockdown and after the first day of distance learning, with comprehensive solutions based on platforms. And mainly they used Microsoft Teams and Google Classroom to organize the distance learning among their students. I think that is all that I can say about the background of the distance learning. And what we would like to present today to you is some data that were collected in this region, and especially with the students. So we did a full sample in all middle schools in the region in the valley. As I already mentioned, we have 7 middle schools who had about, in the grades that we asked or that we used for the survey, about 230, 240 students each. But as we are using data from a longitudinal sample or longitudinal study that was conducted in the 7th grade before the pandemic, as well as in the 8th grade last year within the pandemic, we have 155 students who were or who we took into account for that survey. The survey was a paper pencil survey. And as I already mentioned, it's part of a longitudinal study. So we collected data in the 7th grade, the 8th grade. We also collected data this year in the 9th grade, and we will do so in 2022 in the 10th grade. So as I already mentioned, the students were part or were in the situation in the 8th grade that they were directly before the transition to the next school, which happens between the 8th and 9th grade. So the data that we collected give us some insights of their perceptions about the transition. Yes, that's, I think, all I would like to say, and I hand over to my colleague.
Thank you. Our main research question for the presentation today is how or which factors impacted on how well students could cope with the situation during lockdown, especially with the demands of distance learning. So we have this construct of how well did students cope with the demands. Most of them are self-regulatory, and we have different groups of factors that from a theoretical perspective can be assumed to interact with their situation in distance learning. So one is contextual factors about the family and the students themselves, like the parental education, whether they speak German as a first language, and the gender. Then we have especially from the survey in the year before, information on their academic achievement and learning motivation prior to lockdown. We have factors of support during lockdown, while the parent support more is operationalized on how the relationship between parents and student is being perceived. So it's more an emotional kind of support. The teacher support is hands-on during distance learning phases. How could they reach teachers? And then we have a fourth group of factors that are not connected with learning itself, but which Livia mentioned before, were connected with the situation, feeling of loneliness because of those strong restrictions of the lockdown as such, and the perspective on their future career, school career, feeling of uncertainties about their own future. So our main variable as dependent variable is this construct on distance learning. You see the items here that we used, they are combined, used as a scale. And as you mentioned before, most of them can be connected with ideas of self-regulatory demands of distance learning. And I'll present the whole model, even though that is quite a lot at one point, and try to guide you through the model step by step. So let's have a look at this first block. We find we have the parental education in different steps, and so don't worry about the special categories. But you see that parental education as such cannot be connected with how well students did during lockdown or how they perceived their coping. But we must add or come back to the fact that Livia mentioned before, that the parental education has a quite low variance in the valley. We do see a small effect of whether the first language is German, or one of the first languages of the student is German or not. And we see an effect of the gender, meaning that female students perceive their coping with distance learning a little bit better than boys. The most important group of variables for the model, also in terms of figures, is the block on school performance prior to lockdown. We used academic achievement in the grades just before the last certificate, before the pandemic sort of had consequences on their learning, and the learning motivation measured a year before the start of the pandemic. And this is the block that explains most of the variants and is very powerful in explaining differences in how well students coped. We also have the support. Responsiveness in the relationship between parents and students did help students to cope with the whole situation and also with distance learning. So the parental support is here not, my mother helped me do the tasks given, but it's the kind of social background, social foundation you have, emotional foundation you have at home. And the teacher support, as I said, very hands-on, connected with getting in touch with your teachers and things like that. And then we have fourth group, and that's a very interesting in how they relate to the rest, especially the one on feeling of uncertainty about future school career. So we asked students, did you worry during the time about how well you will be able to cope with the demands in the next school? Do you have the impression to have missed subject matter? Also general factors like, I worried about the future. You will see the items at the end of the presentation because there is then another very interesting aspect connected with them. What I would like to say is that including them in the regression model is a little bit difficult because the direction of the influence is not clear. So it seems as we handle them or as we modeled it, that sort of those are independent variables that would influence coping with self-regulatory demands. Probably this is a relationship that goes in both directions.
5 minutes.
Thank you. So we come to the conclusions and try to stress a few things that can be looked at, especially from that. First thing, I mentioned it already, is academic achievement was in the model the most important factor by far in explaining how well students could cope with their self-regulatory demands and distance learning. This seems to have gotten little attention in the public and policy handling of this. Mostly all measures compensating or trying to compensating missed learning opportunities during the school year were only targeted at students in Austria, at students from migrant backgrounds. But not only students with migrant backgrounds started off with low motivation or low academic achievement. So you can see this as a bivariate forum, just connecting the level of academic achievement here in 3 groups, and their self-regulated learning, meaning the coping with self-regulatory demands. And you see quite important differences in how well those 3 groups coped or did not cope so well. We have as a second major conclusion that we find a combined burden of transition and crisis. So this is a group of students that had a very special situation and has got very little attention in our what we saw. So we have the uncertainty of transition, as we have that just because of changes and how humans react to changes. But we have this for this group of students combined with the uncertainty of the pandemic. We had a lot of distance learning just prior to the transition. We had then more remote or alternative teaching than classroom teaching in the next year, in their whole first year in the new school. And we must expect that the crisis will not be solved for them when the restrictions end, but that we will have to deal with the consequences in a longer term. So if we had a short look back on the timetable, we have the lockdowns here. The first Livia mentioned that influenced sort of the perceptions in our study. And when we look at how this group of students who were in grade 8 at the in the year when the pandemic started, Then we have this phase of distance learning we talked about, and the rest of the school year was alternated teaching with only one group in school. That's when we had our survey. Then they had holidays during the summer, and then they changed typically to new schools for the new school year between mid-September and mid-July, which is their grade 9. And all of them have changed schools during this period, and came to new schools where they did not know the schools, not how things work there. They didn't know the teachers, and they did not know sometimes not any other students, at least only a few. And what we find is, especially for upper secondary and in Tyrol, we had a lot of distance learning and then a very long phase of alternated teaching. So if you look, you find normal phases of teaching as we know it at the very beginning and at the very end. And then we have only distance learning and alternated teaching in completely new schools and classes for them. So I'll hand over and try, and Livia, would you pick it up from here?
Yes, so the third conclusion that we would like to share with you is the aspect of gender. So as Claudia already mentioned, was the uncertainty and the loneliness scales that we were looking into detail. And what we figured out is that there were stronger feelings of uncertainty for girls in the period of distance learning. So girls tend to worry more about their future during transition phase. And this is even more so the case when combining the lockdown and distance learning. We also figured out that the attention is needed for the social and psychological mid and long-term consequences of the phases of strong uncertainty. So if we have a closer look to our findings and to the questions that we asked the students in relation to uncertainties, we saw that all, I think it's the other way around, but anyhow, we saw that the female students mentioned often and sometimes much more than the male students. So everywhere where you see an M, that's actually F. Sorry. Everywhere where you see the F, that's the male part. So especially the female students thought about the new school and worried about the leaving certificates and the grades at the end of the grade 8. And I think this is a very important information that was not discussed yet in that aspect in depth, that you have to really take care of the uncertainties that the young people are facing. And I think this is also connected to the impressions that I actually had this week. So this week was the first week in Austria where the schools were fully open again for all students. And I'm a teacher as well, and my students told me that it is very complicated for them after such a long period of time to reintegrate in a full open school, especially related to the aspects that they were taught more than 13 months that they should take care of distance and should take care of the health of others, and now sitting together again with 32 students in a classroom and not being able to hold the distance. And I think that has a lot of effects of the students right now, right at the moment. And as far as I can see, policy and the educational system is not really taking this into account. And I think the three aspects that we showed you here are directly aspects that are linked to a policy level and to discussions that should be taken further in the future or in the next couple of months. Yes, I think we are at the end of our presentation, and for that I would thank you very much for listening to us.
Thank you very much for this really inspiring presentation. I think we now have two really different perspectives. One's the teachers, students at universities, and the students at school. So the floor is open for any questions. We don't have any in the chat now, so if you wish, you can also just raise your hand to pose your question. Christina Debenjak, I think, put something on. No. If there are no questions from the audience, I'm very curious about some of the aspects in your survey. You said you actually did a survey even before the pandemic. What was it meant to be like before the pandemic? So I don't think you foresee that the pandemic will come and you try to evaluate the data beforehand. So what was the initial plan for the survey?
We had actually planned a longitudinal survey on the students in as part of this project in the region. And the focus was originally only, or furthermore, foremost on the transition process. That's why we started with surveys at the end of grade 7, and then had planned to have a survey with the same cohort every year until their grade 10, which would be the point of time where the transition sort of was over for them and decisions would have been taken. When we had actually planned the second survey for May 2020, where no one was at school at the time, but then we're very lucky to be able to convince the school authorities and the schools as such to allow us to do a survey at the very end of the summer term. So we then went to the schools during the last 2 weeks of the summer term with the second round of surveys, adjusting to going twice to every school because only half of the students was there at one time. And then in preparing the second round of the service for the second round, it was clear that we couldn't ignore the pandemic and distance teaching, so that sort of came into the study, well, because it had to, in a way.
And I think we continued with that approach now that we are continuing our longitudinal study in the 9th grade this year. And as you see, the situation this year got even worse in comparison to the situation last year. And so distance learning was a huge part of the survey this year as well. But I think that especially the focus on transition and the pandemic is a focus that is not so common right at the moment in the discussions. So I think this is a very crucial aspect for young people to have that difficult situation facing among the situation.
It is a really fascinating topic because we know that it's already difficult for students to make this transition, but to make it with not even knowing the other people around, the other students, the teacher might make it extremely difficult for some of the students. Did they get used to this distance learning before they made the transition, the students? So,
well, I think it's hard to say, as I just mentioned, for them right at the moment, this is a very uncommon situation after 13 months of pandemic to sit together with all students in a class. And so I would say in a way they get used to have distance learning and this alternate schooling. But what we also recognize strongly in other studies is the psychological effects that distance learning had on the students, especially on this age of these students. So the older the students get, the more they were coping with, anxiety and low motivation. And as Claudia said, I think one of the main groups that were ignored by the policy were the low achievement groups. And as Claudia also said, in Austria, mainly students with no German first language or no first language speaker were addressed with supportive initiatives, but not the low achievers. And I think this is really, really important to find supporting systems for these low achievers.
I see lots of heads nodding, so I think there seems to be an agreement, at least among our group, that this is a really pressuring and important topic that we can't ignore. So thank you so much for this inspiring presentation. I'm looking forward, hopefully, to hear the next parts of the studies. It's not over yet, so it would be really interesting to see how it's developing further in the future. We now move on to our third presentation. Now we are changing places, so we have a presenter from Slovenia, from our host university of these conferences. It's Anja Gruden, and she's talking to us about moving faces in a square, motivation and communication, encumbrances and online distance teaching, group work. So we are changing the topic a little bit to group work. So I would say the floor is yours, Anja.
Hi, firstly, I want to really thank all the presenters before me who gave I think raised really important questions, and I think that have very much to do with also with my presentation, in which somehow I think I realize I'm going to be giving more questions than answers. And as you see from the title, "Moving Faces in a Square," I'm going to use this venue to address certain issues related to online teachings, but also to maybe talk about, together with some authors and advocates, about a great need to transform the way we to transform our educational system and the way we recognize, understand knowledge, and the way we construe knowledge. So what I would try to argue in my presentation is for a need to construe knowledge as, or to position knowledge, conceptual knowledge, equally to embodied and emotional knowledge. And I'm going to be mentioning Eugene Gentleman's process model, and somehow the way it sort of gives room to address the implicit, and perhaps this could be a sort of way to keep in mind how questions of motivation and communication are so very much relevant in online teaching settings related to group work. But I think also in these times when we are sort of dealing with changes in coming back to regular classrooms, I think there would be a need to address motivation and communication, and also address, I think, give room to share experience of our learning, of how it is to be the way we are just now. Otto Scharmer is an author who talks about reimagining universities, and he gives us a huge account of and talks about the way our society needs to change. And I want to sort of address our attention to the way he sees learning as needing to transform, and the way we could activate more deeper sources of learning. And this perhaps is a bit controversial in terms of relating this to an online settings, but I would argue that this that this is an issue also in online settings. So the way we would be able, up to a certain point, activate deeper sources of learning, very much to do with the questions of embodiment and using the body as a source of knowledge, and as a source of profound transformation. So I wouldn't go into everything he talks about, but there are certain things he says that go very much together with this notion of holding space for sharing the experience of learning. He talks about the need for greater self-awareness, both individually, collectively, and the need for deepening the space for listening and conversation. And even though there are huge encumbrances when we think of online settings, I think this is, even though we need more effort when we're dealing with online settings, I think this is not something we could avoid even in online settings. So to address the embodiment and the embodied parts of learning, so to say. So if I could address or give a really quick general overview of online learning research, more related to group work, which is somehow an oxymoron because or not an oxymoron in terms of we learn in group settings, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's group work learning. So group setting and group work is something I think that there's a huge difference, because if we really nurture group work, we nurture also the sense of community and the sense of, as I'm going to talk later, a sense of shared experience, and maybe this is something I'm going to address later on. But to just give you a quick general overview, when it comes to online learning, I think we all have the experience that it just takes up more time somehow. There's and it takes up more effort. There's much more effort in just where we need to explicate, where we need to communicate and check on communication, and the way the facial nonverbal cues aren't obvious, and the way the implicit needs to be made explicit. Our thinking and also our doing, as we only get a chance to see our upper bodies, but not the whole of the implicit of the body, our body communication. So when I talk about more effort, there's just more effort in actually enabling group work, not just learning in group settings, but actual group work, and there's collaboration involved. And I want to address the last part in the way we simply as educators need to address and recognize reactions to change, even when it comes to, maybe conducting now learning live, as I think one of the previous presenters talked about, the way we would experience this still as another change, and the way change would be seen as you know, reactions to change are similar to those of grief. And I think it's important to address these experiential aspects of how we are like this, how we are in this learning context. I think there needs to be room for that for some reason, but I think it's actually very, very important. And when we talk about presence in online settings, there are two concepts involved with presence. Telepresence, the sense of being there in the environment, so the impression that we're actually there, even though we're not physically present. And the social presence is the sense of being together with others. So the sense of we are together, the sense of a group, of the collective, the sense we're able to share. And so as I would address this importance of embodiment, even in the context of online learning, I would pose a question: if being bodyful, fully embodied in the experience, is even possible in a Zoom session like this? Bodyful is maybe encompassed in a sentence. It's from a book by Sophie Caldwell. How are we when you feel bodyful? She says it's like as if I remembered myself, re-embodied myself. And I would pose a question: did we ever feel like this? Can we enable this via Zoom? It's a question. And just very briefly, I know you all know this. The way communication is not completely synchronous online, which means we get tired more, and large faces can be registered as threatening. Face-to-face communication, when we talk about Zoom communication, means quite literally face-to-face. We don't get the whole picture, and we need to talk more and explain more, and at the same time there's no sense of us quite fully explaining how we are, because there's just not that much data, and there's a need for when we talk about group work in general, there's a need for enabling a joint experience, and the question is, can we do that online? There was some interesting research to do with brain synchrony and the way that the shared attention can enhance both classroom engagement and social dynamics. And the question is, can this be done via online teaching, enabling a joint experience, the way we would share experience together, experience of our learning. And I would also feel the need to mention psychological reliability in group work, which is so important for group work to function. So that means a climate that enables people to ask questions, to admit mistakes, to feel well, to work with each other. Can this be achieved online with more effort, more time, more communication, more group work supervision? Supervision meaning that the educator actually pays attention to what's going on in the group and to the group dynamics, that there isn't a constant enabling of mentoring of group work. And we also know that students learn mostly from peer feedbacks, from peer learning. So to go from personally making sense to collectively meaning making. Can this be achieved via Zooms? The sense of community. When I say community, I would think of, I was talking to a colleague and she would say, what community? What sort of a community? Would they understand what I mean, is this an actual experience, us as a community, when we share, when we're learning online? There are two interesting concepts related to embodiment and embodied learning from Zeitner, Rove, and Jackson, who talk about embodied and embodiary leadership, actually. But I find it has very much to do with educators as well. And I find it interesting how they will talk about the need for us recognizing that sense making is a sensory process, very much to do with moving bodies as well. And I would just make a distinction between embodied and embodiary. And you see from the slides that the sort of distinction they make is that somehow embodied learning is to do with how we express the present, carry knowledge from past, and embodiary somehow has to do with intertwining and imagine. There's a disposition towards the future, imagining and having creative realizations that are embodied and somehow to do with the future. And the premise is that if students become disposed towards a particular concept in an embodiary way, their learning would become more self-motivated, critically reflective, somehow more sustainable. So there is a question of how to invite this sort of learning even to online settings, as somehow to evoke this disposition towards a particular concept. So this is a disposition, an embodied disposition towards a concept, towards conceptual knowledge, as something that enables greater meaning making, and enables, basically invites us to check on with our bodily awareness. And the question is this something somehow a way to enhance motivation and communication in online settings?
5 minutes.
So I would just, so there's the concept of embodied learning, embodiary learning, and the process model by Eugene Gendlin, who's very much related to what I just said. And he uses a different kind of embodied process. He talks of felt sense, felt shift, and this, the way we construe knowledge as inter-affecting, as a relationship between our bodily response and a certain concept. And I think this is a really interesting way of how we could access or enable collective sharing of our embodied experience of learning, even in online settings. And so basically to invite to actively engage, actively enable this this intertwining between the body and the concept, even in online settings, as a way to enhance perhaps motivation and presence. So maybe what I'm trying to say is, if we talk about live, the distinction between live teachings and online teachings, maybe in live we kind of bring classroom in the experience, and perhaps in online teachings the distinction is that we bring experience in the classroom. So we're actively addressing and making an effort in making and inviting our experiences to be shared, and inviting our experiences to be shared as embodied experiences. And maybe this is a way to sort of invite the implicit and to invite the bodies in online settings in which the bodies are somehow left out or always seen as unaddressed. So I will just finish with sort of very briefly stating what I was trying to say. I started by saying that I think there's a need to reformulate, support, and nurture knowledge as equally conceptual, emotional, embodied. And I think there's a need to do that regardless of whether we talk of online or live learning settings. And I think there's perhaps an interesting way to do this by inviting the implicit and the bodies with the help of Gendlin's process model, perhaps. And in general, I really think there's a greater need even now when we're addressing change to just devote hold spaces for students to be able to share the experience, and possibly to share the experience of learning in an embodied way. And probably we need to educate ourselves in how to do this, but I think it's something from my perspective of great importance. And I thank you all for your time in prisons, and maybe I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Anja. I think it was really inspiring and made us all think about the topic you were talking about. So I invite the audience. Are there any questions? There are none in the chat, so you can just raise your hand or speak out. We are a very small group, so I think that should work out as well. Yes, please, Anna Martin Bailon.
Yes, it's not really a question. I just wanted to say thank you for your very interesting presentation. And I just wanted to comment on this concept, embodiary learning, which I found very interesting to think about. And I totally agree with you when you talk about the sense making as a sensory process. I'm also from perhaps a different theoretical perspective, but also been working with these aspects that kind of it's interesting that you talk about the importance of this in relation to distance teaching, because it's like the body is cut off, and that then, or not at all, not completely cut off, but a bit, and that's when you really when this is really highlighted, and you get to see how important the bodily aspects of communications and learning are. I just wanted to ask you if you have looked into I've been very inspired by Alistair Pennycook and his posthumanist applied linguistics, where he also writes about the human hierarchy of senses and the importance of the body in relation to verbal articulations. And I thought it could be perhaps interesting for you to have a look at. I just wanted to say that, and thank you. It was really inspiring to listen to you.
Thank you very much. I very much have a look at it. I can't say that I know it from before. Can you spell it again? I couldn't really hear the author well.
I'll write it in the chat for you.
Okay, yeah, that's good.
Comments or questions? We still have a couple of minutes. As long as the others think about your presentation, I want to make a comment or ask a question. So what I was wondering, what is the role of knowing each other before having this online experience? I have a couple of friends I know very well, and we're very good at communicating online, and it doesn't feel like we're missing a lot of bodily experience because we know each other so well that we can read our facial expressions much better than an unknown person. So what's the difference here? And yes, what is also the impact of having the black boxes with no video at all, talking to a lot of squares, black squares without even pictures? So that would be really interesting. Do you have an idea? Have you thought about this as well?
When I mentioned this, I would think of a student I encountered in my practice as a counselor in counseling for students, and she would be a first-year student, and with an experience of only large group works, and she would say, I just have trouble seeing myself as a student, and I wish I at least had a student card to know I'm a student, because otherwise I don't really have this notion of being a student, and I don't even have this notion of knowing other students, because there are only large group, group work in large settings, and there's just no sense of if I can even connect with others and sort of make this gesture of us maybe meeting informally. So I say this is, as I think others mentioned, this is, I think, there's a huge difference in terms of whether we are already a group and now we're meeting online, and there's a certain structure that's been set already in terms of group work. And if we only met online and we still need to establish us as a group, I think there's a huge difference in that. And I can only say this from an experiential point of view, and pose it as a question. I don't have any data on this. I think you had another question or remark, but I forgot.
Oh, yeah, I was also wondering what the effects, not just more as a comment to think about, of all these black boxes with the names have on us. So beforehand, I was bad remembering students' names, but I knew all their faces. I knew how they were behaving in class, how active they were. Now I started to know their names, but I had no faces. I had no idea about their voices, about them. So I think for me, it made a huge difference. Of course, now I read the students' work and I know the name, but I don't really know who the students is. I think this is also a thing we have to think about, because in bigger groups, they usually have this black boxes, what is totally fine because the system doesn't handle everything well. And it's a bit weird of being all the time observed in this box. What are your thoughts on this?
I only talk from my experience with students that I just recently expressed my frustration, and when I met this group for the second time, actually, and it was a huge group, and I could understand them not really not really wanting to expose themselves, but at the same time, I said I would really invite them into just showing them their faces in a way, and it worked, and I think I think it just has to do with putting more effort and more communication and talking about what's behind the need to not really show yourself, and how are we feeling in all these strange little boxes. And I think it's to do with addressing this over and over and talking about it and talking about our experience of how this is affecting us. And for me to actually do group work in little groups, it's, you know, we need to see each other, otherwise it doesn't really make sense. And yeah, that's what I have on this.
We have one more comment. Christina Deveniak, please. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I would also like to thank Anja for this inspiring presentation. I was also touched about this comment you made about community, that if we still know what community is and what is a collective knowledge to learn in a community. So, and also listening on other presentations, I had this feeling we are with online teaching going more and more into a banking system of education. And so this is a question how, I don't know if it's a question or a comment unopened, if it's still possible to create a community, or is it still important for the education to really have this part, and how we can still make it. Also regarding actually on a presentation before that you, the other researchers said, it is so hard for the pupils to be back in a full class with having in mind the social distancing we were having all the time said to us, now how to have again a feeling of community all together in also a physical place. So maybe if you have some thoughts on that, or maybe somebody else.
I would be open the floor and invite.
I think this was a really nice food for thought once more for us to think about. I think at least I go out of the session thinking about lots of things, what's going on in student teacher education, what's going on with the student, and what's happening to all of us as a community as having experience in this online format. So yeah, I go out in this break having a lot of inspiring ideas and thoughts in my mind. We are at the end of our session, and I want to thank all the presenters again, and of course the audience for posing really interesting and nice questions and having a really nice communication going. As far as I read the program, we are starting at 10:45 again with another round of sessions, and we will have now 15 minutes break to relax a little bit and maybe look outside of the window to the real life. I would love to have more private chats with you if we could be in Ljubljana and talk to us bodily. But of course, next year, we hope this will be possible again and we can catch up on these discussions. So thank you again and see you later in the conference.